Hey everyone, this is M Night TV. I'm Keith Robinson. I've really enjoyed this video that's coming up. This is part one of a conversation with me and James Morgan, talking about delivering data governance to large enterprise. Really enjoyed it. Could have talked for hours, which is saying something given the subject. James is really experienced, top data leader, so I'm sure you get as much value out of it as I did. So don't forget to watch to the end. Stay tuned for part two and hit subscribe to see more data-driven content governance across large enterprise. Before this call, I was thinking that some companies, not all companies, want to dive into a sort of machine learning AI project and often neglect building and maintaining good data governance across the enterprise. So yeah, I know you've done a lot of good work in this space. You've worked with some big companies implementing this stuff. So I was keen to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I think the main thing is if you try and start a conversation talking about data governance, you're probably going to lose your audience. So what you really got to think about is the whys behind the subject, and the why that is so much easier to talk about and so much more important for the organization is trust. And any organization that has customers, has suppliers, has interactions with basically anyone else, which is virtually every company, must build up trust. And one of those massive elements of trust these days that people are and companies are very sensitive about, quite rightly, is can they trust you with with their data? And that's the other thing you've absolutely got to remember. In most instances, it's their data. I like to think that they're lending it to an organization to use. And when you're using that data, you have to be open and honest with yourself as well as them about what are you using it for? Why are you holding this information? What are you going to use it for? And is that use something that's there to benefit the customer? So there's very legitimate, sensible things that most customers will get. I need to process a transaction. Therefore, I need to know who you are so that I can send you things when you buy them, because otherwise they're just not going to arrive. And the trust element is one, obviously, that you're going to send them the product, but two, that you're going to hold that address carefully, correctly, because if it's not correct, it's going to arrive at the wrong house or with the wrong name on it, or won't arrive at all, because once it gets to somebody who wants to send it out, they won't be able to find the address. That's the simplest form, is to enable a transaction, enable a delivery. And most customers, and the way I like to think about governance is, could they understand and really buy into your explanation of why you're holding information for them and what you're doing with it? And that's the basis of a lot of data protection and GDPR. Is there a legitimate reason you're holding this information? Are you using it for their benefit? And most importantly these days, to then get onto the compliance side, is have you got their consent to do that? So things like a delivery address, absolutely legitimate interest of the company. But once you start spreading wider than that, especially into the realms of marketing and sales, then you've absolutely got to have their consent for holding that data.
Two comments on that. In your career, did you notice a big difference in that sort of pre-GDPR and post-GDPR? Was there a big difference within companies?
It depends on the organizations. When I was working with telcos quite a few years ago, quite rightly, there was a lot of noise in the media and from the regulators around the kinds of information that the telcos hold, because it is very rich, very diverse. So organizations like the ones I've worked in that field were very aware of data and the not only regulatory reasons why you need to hold it and process it properly, but also on that value exchange with the customer and why it's so important to build that trusted relationship. So they were on the page years ago. Other organizations, yes, it did take a bit of sadly, the influence of GDPR for them to really start taking it seriously. And that's the other way you can explain data in an organization. I prefer to talk about in terms of the value you can create the relationship you can build with the customer.
Mhm.
In some areas, even in those that get it from the customer side,
Yeah.
you then start to talk about the regulations and the compliance side of things.
Mhm.
And certainly the large potential fines that GDPR brought in
Mhm.
have caused a number of companies that hadn't woken up before to wake up.
Yeah.
And therefore, you're not only able to have a conversation with an organization about the customers, the value exchange, the trusted relationship, you are also then able to have a conversation about the risk profile of the organization,
Yeah.
and the potential risk of a significant fine, not just on, say, the profits in the UK this year, but on the global turnover of a company,
Yeah.
which starts to make people really sit up and listen. So sadly, I think some companies did need that kick and did need that realization. Other companies, other sectors were aware already.
Yeah. And in your experience, having that clarity as to why you're holding it and what's the value proposition, does that clarify internal processes about what you're trying to do with it, rather than just being able
Yeah,
to hoard things for the sake of hoarding and not thinking through what you're actually doing?
yeah. Taking that process through really helps explain it to people. Becoming a bit of the 5-year-old and asking why becomes really important. And when you start explaining to people, especially the aspect of ownership, so explaining to a commercial director that they really own an amount of this information,
Mm.
and they need to be the ones who are answering the question as to why to hold it.
Mm.
And that's a really good way of talking to anybody within the organization, is about their own personal ownership, their responsibilities in this space, and then really trying to get out of them why they're holding it and what they're using it for.
Mm.
And even before GDPR came in, I was talking to a lot of companies about, or the companies I worked in, about having those legitimate reasons for why you need this information and how long you're storing it. Now, certain things like financial transactions needing to hold for accounting purposes, 7 years information. But on other aspects, if a customer hasn't been with you for a number of years, do you legitimately have a reason to hold that information? Depends on the life cycle and of the product and the engagement relationship and mechanism. But also, what you will often find is the data tells you that in the days when you were allowed to contact customers potentially that had been on your system for a long time or out of date, if you hadn't maintained the data and maintained a relationship with them, then it wasn't good practice to contact them anyway, because they would be unlikely to respond, and rightly so, because you didn't really have a relationship with them.
Yeah. Yeah. So let's take an example of the commercial director. What pushback or challenges have you seen in getting them to understand they're responsible for it? And
yeah, one of the most interesting ones you hear quite often is, hang on a minute, James or whoever, you've been employed as the data expert in the company. You own this data, don't you? You sort it out. And often my rather glib but reasoned response is, well, if I own it, I'll delete it all. I don't need it. I don't have any purpose for the data.
Yeah.
Because a data person quite often on their own cannot create value.
Yeah.
The value comes from the sharp end of the business, the sales, the marketing, the operations, the supply chain. So what you have to then engage in a conversation is, well, yes, if you put all the responsibility on me as a data guy, I don't actually get the value from this information for my organization. You get the value from it, from being able to create relationships and talk to customers. You generate the value because you're able to sell product, deliver services. Therefore, let's have a conversation about why you want this information and how you are going to gain the value from it. And if it weren't there, would you be able to function?
Hey, thanks for watching to the end. Hope you enjoyed the conversation. Stay tuned for part 2, my conversation with James, and hit subscribe now to get more data-driven content. Thank you.